The Scole Group, also known as the Scole Experimental Group, was started by the couple Robin and Sandra Foy. Robin and Sandra have been researching psychic phenomena for over 40 years. Both have extensive experience in observing physical mediumship and physical phenomena. They have also had the opportunity to work with a number of mediums. Many of them are, or were well known in the field. Robin was a former RAF pilot whose interest in physical paranormal phenomena led him to found the Noah's Ark Society, NAS. Sandra Foy was active in the background over a 25-year period. In an interview she once said, "I myself have retreated into the background, as I am a very private person and actually reluctantly talk to interested people about Scole and physical mediumship, also don't participate in radio or Skype interviews." In August 1991, the Foys moved from Prestwick to Scole, Norfolk, in the northeast of England, and then conducted the so-called Scole experiment from 1993 to 1998. This was an extensive program of spectacular physical mediumistic phenomena. Many different experiments took place in the basement of Foy's farmhouse. The Foys were joined by medium couple, Alan and Diana Bennett. Alan is a retired carpenter. Diana is an intuitive and healer. Both have had psychic abilities since childhood. Alan and Diana have always been committed to the evidence of the phenomena that occurred during the Scole experiment. Diana was responsible for transcribing the numerous audio tapes recorded during the sessions. Alan was responsible for producing the group's newsletter, The Spiritual Scientist, because of his experience in graphic design. They live on a small farm in rural Norfolk, in the UK. In 1993, Robin and Sandra Foy, Diana and Alan Bennett, formed the Scole Experimental Group as core members, with the goal of creating a direct link between the living and the dead. The couples began to hold sessions in complete darkness to contact the spirits. The goal of the sessions was to obtain undeniable proof of survival after death, and to conduct experiments that would provide repeatable successful results. The experiments would help them provide proof to a scientifically informed public that there is life after death. Many of the Scole experimental sessions were held at the Foy's home, the Street Farmhouse. This place was chosen because the old farmhouse from the 16th century had a cellar that was perfect for conducting the experiments. This cellar, inaugurated in 1993, had become a space for scientific experiments and was also affectionately called the Scole Hole. Many experiments have been conducted, such as paranormal photos and video experiments, videos of materializing ghost faces and even ghost forms. A port. Recorded conversations with deceased. Written messages on sealed film reels. Ghost lights, as well as experiments on transdimensional communication with the Germanium Receptor device. The Scole Group felt that they had come together specifically to work with a spirit team, to develop a new energy for transdimensional communication that was different from the traditional so-called ectoplasmic medium. Soon after the Scole experiment began, a team of spirit communicators contacted the group during the experimental sessions. By testing entirely new forms of tangible paranormal phenomena, the spirit team wanted to prove once and for all that death does not exist, and that there are other dimensions of existence. The group was told that their spirit team alone consists of thousands of minds all working together to provide this tangible proof of the existence of other dimensions. The Scole Experimental Group conducted twice-weekly experiments with electronic devices to try to establish communication links with other dimensions of existence. This was called transdimensional communication, or TDC for short. At one meeting, Scole Group members were asked to bring a sealed 35mm Kodachrome Polaroid film and place it in a sealed wooden box. This wooden box was placed on the table. The spirit team then communicated through one of the mediums that something related to the experiments would be transferred to the film. After the sealed Kodachrome Polaroid film was removed from the wooden box and unpacked, important information was visible on the film. Shown was the Germanium Receptor and its connections to an amplifier. Also shown were two coils in the circuit. This roll of film was about 50 centimeters long, and even contained text that the spirit team had added. This instruction described how the two coils were to be connected, and their position to the germanium crystal. The spirit team explained during the next session that there would be an interaction between the germanium crystal and the coils. The proximity of the coils, as well as their polarity, was an important factor in the mechanism required to receive the communications. These are not electromagnetic fields, but energy fields or energy patterns. The principle on how the receptor works is quite simple. In the drawing on the Kodachrome film, A shows a germanium plate under mechanical pressure. A metallic tip, for example of a screw, is placed with slight pressure on the surface of a germanium chip. On both sides of the germanium chip, two coils, B and C, are connected in parallel, which generate an opposite magnetic field. By using a shielded cable, the receptor is connected to the input of an amplifier or recorder, in the drawing marked with 1 and 2. During a meeting in November 1996, the Scole team had invited some researchers as guests. They were the researchers, Montague Keen, a journalist, David Fontana, professor of psychology, and Arthur Ellison. Montague Keen, born on the 7th of February 1925 in London, and died on 15 January 2004 also in London, at age of 79 years, was a journalist and later a farmer, investigated crop circles and mediums, and was a leading member of the Society for Psychical Research. Montague Keen was a crop scientist, and held a senior position in the National Farmers Union. He had been a member of the Council of the Society for Psychical Research since 1972 and was one of the three authors, with David Fontana and Arthur Ellison, of the Scole Report, which investigated the alleged contact of a mediumistic group with spiritual entities. He was also closely associated with the Center for Crop Circle Studies. Keen's main interests were survival studies and especially physical mediumship, which he wrote about frequently in the SPR Journal. His widow has claimed that he had contact with the spirit world. David Fontana was born on the 1st of January 1934, and died on the 18th of October 2010. He was 76 years old and was an academic psychologist and psi researcher whose numerous books cover topics such as transpersonal psychology, dreams, and surviving death. He was a British academic psychologist who worked at the universities of Minho and the Algarve in Portugal and at the University of Wales in Cardiff. He was also one of the 3 principal authors of the Scole Report. Fontana has published books on dreams, meditation, and spirituality. Between 1995 and 1998, he was president of the SPR, and chaired the Survival Committee for several years. At the time of his death, he was investigating electronic voice phenomena, EVP, with Annabella Cardoso, editor of the instrumental Transcommunication journal. Arthur J. Ellison was born in Birmingham on 15 January 1920, and died the 6th of September 2000. Also in London, at the age of 80 years. He was an emeritus professor of electrical engineering, studied engineering at the University of London, and worked in industrial settings, as an electrical designer. Did research with psychics, and was president of the Society for Psychical Research, SPR. The SPR was founded in London in 1882 and was the first organization devoted to the scientific investigation of claims of psychic phenomena. The spirit personality explained that the device would helpfully allow communication beyond the normally accepted, established parameters. The device was a type of communication that the spirit personality believed had never been attempted before. This communication link would come from other realms or dimensions, but not necessarily from the afterlife. This method of connection would also form as transdimensional links between other dimensions. This device would incorporate a piece of germanium that was to be put under a small amount of pressure. But what exactly is germanium? Germanium is in the periodic table in the series of semi-metals, and is a rare, shiny hard, gray-white element, that is chemically similar to its group neighbors tin and silicon. Pure germanium is classified as a semiconductor, with an appearance similar to elemental silicon. Elemental germanium is very brittle and very stable at room temperature. For a long time, germanium was the leading material in electronics. Here it was almost replaced by the cheaper silicon, a development that is slightly declining again with the increasing use of silicon germanium transistor materials in computer chips. But now, back to building the germanium receptor. After the spirit team explained how the construction of the germanium receptor was to be done, they went on to design and build the device. The drawing of the germanium receptor was illustrated on a Kodachrome film. The technical requirements and details regarding the construction of the germanium receptor were discussed with Professor Ellison, who seemed very excited to be involved in the participation of this experiment, and was also enthusiastic about the technical challenges. The germanium device is a receiver that is connected to a battery-powered amplifier and a tape recorder. The germanium receptor does not function as a receiver for radio signals, but rather according to an unknown principle that would help the experimenter to communicate with the other world. There is also no microphone connected, so only the communication from the other world is recorded, but not the communication of the experimenters in the room. There are also no electromagnetic fields involved, but rather unknown energy fields or patterns. The technology required for these communications is fundamentally different from the technology used in our world, and there is nothing similar in ours. That is why there is no basis or model in our modern physics. Professor Ellison determined, during the setup phase, that the team needed amplification that operated at an extremely low voltage, specifically in the millivolt range. Further discussion of the technical aspects of the experiment confused Professor Ellison because he considered the spirit team's proposed equipment and techniques to be completely outdated. As Professor Fontana was invited to participate in a special meeting of the Scole Group on the 11th of November 1996, Professor Ellison asked his colleague to discuss the matter. At the following meeting, Professor Fontana took up Professor Ellison's question of whether it was possible to replace the germanium rectifier with a silicon diode. The spirit scientist was insistent, however, that this was not a rectifier and should not be considered in that way. He and other members of the team argued that germanium was absolutely necessary because it had spiritual and healing properties. After Professor Ellison received the information from Professor Fontana, and despite his continuing reservations about the suitability of the germanium device as a communications instrument, the receiver was constructed in the weeks that followed. At the next Scole meeting on the 3rd of January 1997, the device was presented, having been built by the group, under his supervision. At this meeting, Professor Ellison also took a box containing an amplifier and a tape recorder. The amplifier had a high impedance input, was battery powered, and was mounted in a common shielding enclosure with the recorder. In addition, an external loudspeaker was used. This box was built by a graduate student of Professor Ellison. Ellison then connected this box to the germanium device, which from then on became known as the Germanium Receptor. The dimensions of the device were quite small, about 63 by 32 millimeters. The receptor was connected to an amplifier, with a short connecting cable. The germanium plate had a size of length 3 millimeters, a width of 2.5 millimeters, a thickness of 1 millimeters, and lay on a copper sheet strip, which in turn rested on a foam pad. The screw was a 3 mm screw. This pressed from above on the germanium plate, and thus closed the electrical contact. Two similar coils, about 10 mm in diameter and 18 mm long. The number of turns was unfortunately not specified. The coil resistance was 5,000 ohms, with an iron core, were arranged side by side in parallel at a distance of their longitudinal axes of 50 mm. The sense of the windings was unidirectional, so that their like poles pointed in the same direction. The germanium plate was located in the center of the coil assembly, which was mounted on a wooden board with a length of 80 mm, a width of 50 mm, the thickness was about 10 mm, and the whole receptor was covered with a plastic case.
This is the TDC device.
This is a short clip with Robin Foy where he describes the germanium receptor in an interview on YouTube.
Bigger than a matchbox.
My goodness.
It's got a couple of coils, and it's sort of, if you look at it sideways, you can see it's not very thick and it's not very long. There's a connecting coil here that plugs into, in our case today, a boombox, so that Spirit can use the amplifier to talk to us.
After reading a lot about the germanium receptors from the Scole Group, I wanted to build my own receptor. The first thing to do was to make a framework. The choice was made of multi-layered wood span plates. The framework was made by a good friend of mine, who unfortunately died too early and too young. Then, I created an L-shaped holder from a copper sheet clip. On this holder, a germanium chip will be positioned, and the holder is used as an electrical conductor. The holder was then drilled and mounted to the wooden framework. I also placed a piece of foam padding under the bracket to cushion the germanium plate when adjusting the screw contact pressure. In the next step, I arranged coils with an impedance of 5000 ohms. These I disassembled from commercially available relays. The coils were then arranged in parallel on the wooden frame and mechanically fixed with screws. When disassembling the coils, it is important to take care not to damage the windings. I'm not sure if it matters how the windings of the coils have to be mechanically connected against each other. So, both coils parallel connected in the same way, or even anti-parallel. Further tests will follow. Finally, I assembled all the parts of the germanium receptor. The long screw was fixed with 2 nuts to set the correct height, and therefore the pressure, on the germanium plate. On the side of the wooden framework, I mounted a small PCB with an audio jack. The germanium receptor is then connected to an amplifier on this connector. The thickness of the cables, I have chosen extra thicker, to better mechanically form and fix it. For further constructions of the germanium receptors, I will use smaller and more manageable cables. A few more impressions of the construction follows. Now, it's time to hear what the germanium receptor sounds like. Attention, please do not listen with headphones, because there are some very loud noises. This was my documentation about the germanium receptor. If you found it interesting, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and share my link with other interested people. Stay tuned.